Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar, on which we'll be focusing on how hybrid working is impacting space and design. My name is David Thomas, and I'll be today's host. To begin with, I'll just quickly outline kind of what we're going to be going through, and then we can dive into it. So firstly, we're going to be looking at a bit of how employees' expectations have changed in the workplace and how the workplace has to respond to those expectations. And then we'll look from kind of both the data and design perspective of how design policy is changing and what has been successfully introduced within the workplace kind of across industries and different sectors. And then thirdly, we're going to look a little bit at kind of what the new workplace has to deliver and how success has changed from pre-COVID to this now hybrid era. And then we're also going to be kind of talking about the data that people are using, the metrics that are very useful to measure when you're talking about designing and optimizing spaces. For those joining us for the first time, Dan's taken part in a couple of things with us now and has a background as a strategist and associate director at KSS Savills. So if you did just want to start off by saying a bit about what the core changes you've seen in the workplace have been since pre-COVID to now, like kind of what was it like before, what kind of work were you doing, and where are you at now?
So I guess looking over the past nearly 3 years now, first of all, the work we received and the clients we work with changed drastically because all of a sudden everyone could access video, and we were holding meetings over videos on our screens. We'd have to meet people in person. So for us, it's a fantastic advantage as a business. We could speak to anyone in the country or anyone in the world and carry out our work and our strategies and our workplace design with anyone now without having to particularly meet them in person. And we have successfully carried out many projects over the lockdown pandemic period, even without meeting people in person, and successfully delivering projects. So for us, it was a bonus from that point of view. But for the clients, it meant that obviously they were also experiencing the same thing. Everyone was at home, obviously. So what did that mean for the workplace? So I guess the main differences in terms of what that workplace design was, what people expected out of a workplace, the main and obvious differences was that I'd say 2019 beforehand, if you had an office that hadn't been redesigned or refreshed in 5 or 10 years, you'd be looking to expect much more than just open plan desks, some meeting rooms, perhaps client and internal, a tea point, and if you're very lucky, a social space to break out into, have some lunch. I think that's what most people would see as a normal, standard corporate office throughout the UK. And then obviously now, looking forward, I think the expectation now is, and I think people are on board with it, whenever we start a new project, is that you have those things, but we've really ramped up on the collaboration, social side, and the interaction of people. So people now understand why we're using offices. It's to meet people, not just to do desk-based work. Obviously, for some people, that's still main priority if they've got it at home. But now, the breakdown of workspace is typically, obviously, they've still got your open plan desks, but now you've got more drop-in, bookable desks, collaboration spaces, more internal meeting rooms, places to take calls, client rooms, multifunction spaces, more social space to meet informally and relax and break out. And then also now more health, wellbeing facilities that deal with a whole range of neurodiverse, different genders, different mental health issues. So the whole range now is being catered for to welcome people back in, show that they're being cared for. And then if a client can successfully deliver an office that's better than someone working at home,
people will choose to come back into it.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you said that it shifted to kind of putting people at the center of it, because at OpenSensors, before the pandemic, people were kind of approaching us with big events kind of coming up, whether it was a lease event, an expansion, growing the team, that kind of thing. Very much needed to understand the baseline kind of how is the office being used, what do we have space to expand into, kind of all very kind of clinical in a way. But since the pandemic's been going on, the concerns and questions that people have been coming to us with have very much been more about, like you said, people making sure that, we want to make sure that they have all the space they need all the time, not just access to a desk, access to a fridge, that kind of thing. And it's also the challenges that employees face, I guess, have been more centralized. So actually getting those spaces, if we're going to be in a hybrid environment and you don't have your own space, a lot more thought now has to be put into how do we enable people to get to that space quickly and easily without having to do 5 or 6 repetitive tasks at the beginning of the day just to be able to get into your desk type thing. And we've found that that's significantly shifted since COVID.
Exactly. Yes, it's a double-edged sword, I think. Making the better use of real estate requires some element of sharing, and by proxy, that then requires some more elements of decision-making and forward planning. So the users of that space and the managers of that space will ultimately have to make more decisions, think about it more to make sure it's used most efficiently.
So what would you say the kind of core concerns or challenges that people are approaching you with now when they say we need to redesign? What would you say the kind of key criteria that like it must do this, it must do this, and it must do that?
I'd say, well, the key ones is being confident with the level of usage. So if they're going to bite the bullet and say, if they're going to go from what was pre-pandemic a generally one desk per person, so one desk per headcount scenario, you then have to have the confidence that whatever you're basing the future design on, and at the minute we're finding out to be like mostly 50-60% of a headcount relates to a desk count now, the traditional desk count. It's having the confidence on that. So that's one of the main things. And whether they find that through surveys or sensor data is 2 ways of doing it. And yes, and then just making sure that people feel safe, obviously, to come back and make them feel worthwhile. So then the management of the whole space and what happens in a workspace now is more key rather than someone just turning up, sitting at a desk, doing a day's work, going home, not thinking about it. If you do that, and you've left the office at the end of the day and you wonder why you ever came in, who did I even speak to, what have I experienced today, is it worth my while? It's then making sure that those things happen as well. So it started happening before the pandemic. There was the new roles of sort of chief employee experience officer. These sorts of roles came into place to make sure that the experience an employee had in the workplace, engaged them. And whether they come in 5 days a week, 1 day a week, 3 days a week, there might be something happening that makes it worth their while and sparks their interest as well at the same time.
It's already the case that people that I live with kind of get told by the managers and their teams and just kind of across the board, you need to be in for these amount of days. They kind of get in and they sit down and they're like, I talk to fewer people there than I would if I was working at home because I can't see them. It feels like sometimes it's a bit directionless. Goal of just getting people back into the office for the sake of them having them back in the office when nothing's really changed to promote the office is one that kind of needs correcting, I would say. And workplace design is one of the ways that we've seen that be happening. Kind of like, if I'm going to leave my home where I've got everything that I need, the office has to offer more, but it also has to be very easy to actually get in there in the first place. You don't want to struggle. And we've seen different tools kind of emerging, like booking solutions, to actually enable that access to be quite smooth. And then once you're in there, you know that everything you need is right at your fingertips and already booked. I guess what I'm leading on to is, with the design in place, what kind of are you suggesting people do to promote that flexibility? What designs are emerging in terms of the actual how spaces are being used to create flexible environments?
I suppose it comes from two sides. There's the actual physical layout, and then there's the tech behind it, as you've alluded to. So, like I say, the tech behind it has to be as smooth running as anyone's personal life tech. If you suddenly come to the office and it's a little more clunky, or more, it's not as intuitive, it's another roadblock to make you question why you'd want to use the office space. And then just design-wise, there's both very simple things and very complicated things to think about. The simple things are just, keeping quiet spaces in quiet areas, not having quiet spaces in necessarily loud areas, just expecting those behaviours to happen in those spaces. So it's more than just throwing into a brief some quiet rooms. If they're not well designed, well acoustically sealed, you may as well not have them. Again, it's another roadblock for people using them. So just getting the simple things right, the ranges of spaces, be it loud and quiet, hot and cold, in a workspace, and making them visibly available as well. So I think being able to see them if you're using a workplace app, being able to see them at the touch of a button, what's available, can I book it, is it free now, can I use it? And also being able to look up from any position where you are, seeing that there's a range of places to dive into on your own, or places to grab your team and go into, or even using the space you're in now in a way for team calls without having to then move to a brand new meeting room, for example.
It's safe to say that nowadays you're having to juggle kind of more types of spaces within potentially the same foot space, square meterage of a room. Has it become more complex ensuring that the ratios of space is right? If people expect more than just a desk, a meeting room, and a lunch area, has it become more complex, making sure that you're not providing too much of one thing and completely ignoring something else?
I wouldn't say it's been any more complex. It's what we do. They do out in our business, but it's certainly changed. It's changed a lot. So, as I say, if you think back to the original brief of what was in a workspace, and then the new brief of what's in a workspace, the main differences obviously have been that you're what we call the focus workspace. So it's where you do process work or your team work, open plan desk areas basically. It's reduced significantly. And in replace of that has gone up the collaboration spaces, places to take calls, dropping working spaces as well. So significant balance has shifted in that type of workspace. And then depending on what type of company you are, we've seen a significant change in client space as well, and social space. And in a way, it is harder to judge one space type to the next. So when we benchmark our projects, we've got client space, workspace, social space, common amenities, back of house things. And there's much more of a merging between generally client space, workspace, and social space. So if your company takes your clients into social space to have informed meetings, what do you then call that as? If you invite them into your workspace to use it as well. So the naming process is getting harder. So I presume that is becoming more complex to answer your question. But overall, in terms of sort of like your overall square footage, in these past 2 years, as I say, working with clients from all around the UK, looking at their portfolios, we found reductions overall in terms of the total square footage. But that's not to say that all of their offices reduced in size. So many firms who had offices that perhaps hadn't been designed in the past 10 years, they were growing based on the increase in modern workplace settings, and other ones that perhaps had been designed in the past 5 years, we could find space reductions. So it wasn't a one size fits all, it was making them all up to a new modern standard with all these new work settings, rebalancing those space types, giving a good common standard of service and experience on all those different offices, really.
We actually did a workplace survey where we asked a series of questions and kind of like what people wanted to see in their workplace, what they expected to happen, and if they knew what's going to happen. And we asked whether people were going to expand or consolidate space. And I went into it thinking that it would be very much a we're reducing space would be the clear winner in the poll. But it was actually kind of 50-50 down the middle. And there were some other questions later on which were about what types of space they expected more or less of. And again, these were quite split. And it's later on that we realised we hadn't included some key, like we made it a very binary question. You're either going to expand or reduce. And we'd realised that most people are probably going to repurpose or rethink space as a whole. So instead of having enormous offices within key cities, some people are going to break down into just one big office and then smaller satellites to make it easier for the people that had to commute to not have to commute so far or not have to relocate themselves to the big city in the first place. And it was only by kind of asking further questions that we saw that these plans were more common than we thought, and growth in one office didn't mean that's what was happening across the board in all their spaces. It's become very much more like a location by location is a bit more free to say how they want to work. Have you found that in kind of the people you're dealing with, that there's not so much a single corporate drive going through plans, but locations are kind of being able to choose more freely for themselves what the ideal way of working there is?
I would say to a very large degree, no. But maybe we've just not been on the back end of those more local discussions. There was one of the large portfolio projects we've run in the past 2 years with people redressing all their real estate. It's raised the bar to be a level of experience, well-being, and modern workplace settings across the board. But then I think individually, depending on what those teams do, whether they are front of house facing or more back of house processing, there was then differences in levels of meeting, levels of collaboration, and how much they would then use the office. So I think that's what led it mostly. They, from the design side, most companies do let the local teams have bring in the local touch, whether it's local food or drinks offers or art, to bring into the office space as well. But we sort of design that into the whole portfolio package that allows for those local touches of community, I think, at the same time.
Something you said at the beginning there, where they kind of set these new standards of what the office should achieve. We've worked alongside someone, Louis Lurst of Veldheim & Co, and he works a lot in activity-based working. Well, when we've spoken to him, it's been about getting projects off the ground and how you need to have core themes running through them, which he refers to as guiding principles. So like every stage of your project, if you're encountering an issue, he always said he kind of pushed back against making data-driven and that kind of decision, where he's saying, if you can ask yourself, does this change align with our guiding principle of the project? It's the right thing to do. And that leads me on to my question about success metrics, because I would imagine, and we've seen it, that the principles which run through these projects has shifted as people's desires of what comes out of the workplace has shifted. What would you say the core metrics of success are? So obviously you mentioned stuff like employee experience and stuff, but do you know at all how people are actually going about measuring that or making sure that the workplace is providing that?
Yeah, I guess there's different levels of what people view as success now. Obviously, if they've hit the targets of utilisation, which they've based the design on, so whether they made those decisions first of all through usage data pre-pandemic or through surveys during the pandemic, I guess one level of success is to say we were aiming at, for example, 60% of people in. Are we getting that? Is it slightly below? Is it slightly over? That's one level of success. Then there's all the monetary levels and however you determine productivity as well. There are those levels of success, but those are all measured quite differently with each different firm. I'd say, again, whether the firms have ongoing internal surveys for user experience, those levels of success as well, how engaged people are. And then I guess other than the presence, I think there's more to do with how flexible a space can be. Years ago, we'd look at a floor plan and we'd do a design for a company and sort of imagine it's going to be like that for 5 or 10 years, keep on running. But I think now it's more of a case of you can keep certain areas of a design for an office now more flexible. So these are the fixed parts. Obviously, there's built parts and there's furniture parts, but within those furniture areas, there's a flexibility. I think you have to give your client the confidence to not set a strict layout on, to say that these are the options. Next year it could look like this, the year after it could look like this, and whether they're bringing in a new piece of furniture, just moving around what you've got. I think a level of success is to how can I flex, change, keep it fresh, so that when you are using the office, you don't feel like it's stale, boring every time you come in as well.
That kind of thing has become so much more possible nowadays, because with the workplace data that we gather about OpenSensors, kind of one of the things that people commonly ask us is, we have these assets like the workplace, we want to understand how they're being used and which ones to provide, I guess which ones aren't being used as much. So having those spaces built out within the workplace itself, that those substitutions can be made, and then you can monitor the effect of that change and see, is this delivering better what we wanted it to than before? And know that it's not kind of like be all end all. If you make a change that's not the way, you can just swap it back, because that's how the space is designed to be. So having those spaces is one of the ways that we're kind of having to deal with the flexibility of hybrid workplaces. Are there any other, maybe behaviours or features of hybrid that must be accounted for in design?
Yeah, so I mean, the behavioural side is, although it can always be the least costly of things, it's always it might be the most time costly, and it affects feelings and emotions. But the behavioural side of that change is massive, really. You can't just expect people to get used to something when you change the design of their workspace. So yeah, we've seen obvious differences pre-post pandemic. First one being ownership of desk space. If it was a one desk per person scenario pre-pandemic, you really didn't have to think about where you were going to sit that day. You knew your things were there. You didn't really have to tidy up. You could make a mess. But now, obviously, to make the best use of any real estate. If you're having a shared desk scenario where people are agile and use other spaces on the floor plate. Like I said earlier, it's adding those levels of behavioural difference in, and you have to think about where am I going to sit. Yes, it might be with your team, but it might be which desk within that team. You have to think about where you're storing your things. So now we're having to introduce more personal storage into the floor plates, and it's often quite hard to find spaces to actually build locker spaces. You actually need a solid back wall for that. But it can be useful to break up spaces as well. And then there's the whole cleanliness thing. What am I using? Has it been cleaned overnight or cleaned this morning? Did the person who used it before me clean it? Do I now have to clean it up and tidy it away myself at the end of a day? So there are all these much more behavioural things to think about, which, as long as you believe for the greater good of your firm and your colleagues and your bottom line of what you pay for your real estate, then I think you've hit the nail on the head then, if you can be happy with that.
We've spoken previously with Chris Moriarty, who you've worked alongside with actually. Yeah, he was saying to us on the call that it's a bit of a weird time in the workplace. Everything's kind of merging and evolving, and design is being influenced far more by different groups who never really had a say in it before, such as like HR and the actual facilities teams themselves. So as everything is changing, do you reckon there are any kind of key pitfalls to watch out for when you're designing space, or something that you think is going to be a core concern in the future that isn't quite being addressed yet?
So I'd say really beyond the usage levels, I think, and being confident on that. Again, dealing with the levels of tech and different generations in the workforce, I think there are still problems with that. Also, that depends on how much training you can give. There are always going to be people who struggle and find it hard to get on board with any new digital platforms or even just shared technology put in place, be it docking stations, how to use things in meeting rooms. We can't just expect everyone to get used to it at the same time. So you do have to deal with an extra level of learning and development, as well as the behavioural change, I think, to deal with more agile shared workspaces. And then I guess communication sort of comes into that as well. Just making sure that the platforms are, reduced down. Don't just use every single communication platform under the sun, from WhatsApp all the way through to Teams, via email, via text messages. I think those are the main ones that come out at the moment that we haven't already sort of focused on already in terms of spatially and usage that I can think of.
We often find when we're kind of talking to people about hybrid, there's so many things to consider that, like saying we want this space to be all of this, but then there's so many things to consider that you kind of have to walk people through a process of, if this knocks down this, how are you going to understand the impact of it? Have you considered what's going to happen, like if the change isn't what you wanted it to be? And it's, like I said before, there's so many features to juggle that we kind of have to really help people fully understand what's going on in their workplace to begin with. And there's, like, looking at now post-COVID, so many different kind of new factors which we hadn't before, like air quality and keeping people safe, like well-being being something that workplace data can actually now impact, is very new. It's not particularly like out there yet that the air quality is one of the best ways to actually boost productivity as well and keep people safe from COVID. So there's a lot of new features or new aspects to the workplace we are struggling to keep up with as they come out. There's so many changes occurring on a weekly basis in the workplace.
There is that. Yeah, no, I agree. There are so many facets to focus on, to get right. And the question is, do you try and address every single one of them in a new workplace design? Do you just focus on one main one or a few and get those absolutely right? Obviously, you have to go through the decision process of what they are first. But yes, you're right. You could measure absolutely everything from CO2 levels, temperature, utilisation, when's the coffee machine running out, how much paper's in the printer. And then it depends on how much information you then give the employee of all of those things as well, and then the repercussions of them knowing that as well. So where it is, on one hand, good to know that meeting room that 10 people have been in now has a very high level of CO2 in it, and you might want to open the window, open the doors, and let that dissipate. Is it good to know that? Or is it just good for the facilities team to know that, to then deal with that? So then there are also then levels of anxiety that may also occur if everyone is given all the data, if everything is being measured at the same time as well.
There's a fine line to kind of walk with all these things, and it's probably going to link back to those guiding principles. There's always the thing that you can't really change what you don't know, and if you're armed with more data and more information, you can then start to think about things on a bigger scale, or more. You can start to see things through time that you couldn't previously as well. And at the moment with hybrid is going to be changing week by week, really. Like seasonally, it's probably going to be a big thing, with depending on how COVID goes, or even just with how much people want to leave their home in summer when it's nice and warm.
No, I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people have already witnessed, horrible rainy days of the winter, and just reducing the amount of times they want to leave the house normally, let alone go to the office or not. But yeah, I heartily agree. I've always been a fan, obviously, of sensors, whether it's for utilisation or environment. And I've said it before in one of the blogs about, imagine driving a car without a dashboard where you don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And yet we're trying to operate buildings full of people of what we call offices. And if you don't actually know what's going on, how do you expect to, keep it running well?
I've actually just noticed that we've crept over the half-hour mark without me noticing. Firstly, thank you very much for your time, Dan. It's been great chatting, always is. And thank you everyone who joined this afternoon, and I hope it's been interesting.
Fantastic. Thanks, David.